Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're just waiting for folks to come into the Zoom room and then we'll kick things off. All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. I am Lizzie Wyant. I'm the Deputy Executive Director here at MAPC, and we are so glad to welcome you to our webinar today around transportation funding solutions. We are thrilled to be joined by Senator Crighton and Doug Howgate from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, who will both be talking a little bit about the legislative session and some of the work that they are doing to try to make investments in our transportation system. Just a couple items of housekeeping before I turn it over to the senator. We are recording this webinar. So if you are so excited that you want to watch it again, you will be able to. We'll send that recording out to folks. All participants are muted and are off camera, but we have a question box that you can submit questions to. We will not be answering those questions live today, but we'll be providing some follow-up resources after the webinar to address the questions. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Senator Crighton. We have worked together for a very long time. He was elected to the Senate in 2018 and represents the 3rd Essex, which includes Lynn, Lynnfield, Saugus, Nahant, Marblehead, and Swampscott. And he has been the Senate Chair of Transportation since 2021. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Senator.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. It's been wonderful working with you as well as MAPC and so many folks on this call, including my good friend Doug Howgate from our Senate days, but also now through Mass Taxpayers. And it's been wonderful over the years to collaborate with stakeholders, not just within government, but through MAPC and their networks to focus on these issues. I started this, 19 years ago, working for then Senator Tom McGee. And he was obsessed with transportation then. He still is now, as he continues his role as now the chair of the MBTA board. But during that time, I mean, Tom and we were really focused, as so many folks on this call. Sorry, I should mention Mark Drazen, of course, as well. So many folks on this call looking at transportation, not just as, our roads, our sidewalks, our bridges, our tracks, that infrastructure, but rather what they mean for our Commonwealth as a whole. When you think of our housing crisis, our efforts to fight climate change, when you think about economic mobility, our competitiveness as a state, and so many more issues across the Commonwealth, that all really revolves around transportation. And obviously we've had a number of starts and stops over the years in terms of looking at funding. But the constant message has been that we need much more to achieve a 21st century transportation system that works for all of us. If it's a public transportation system that we're looking at, or transportation system generally, right? We want to be make sure we have equity across the Commonwealth geographically, but also making sure that everyone, regardless of their income or their just situations, that they have access to the best possible transportation system. And it comes with hard choices. I'm very proud of the work we've been able to do this last session, working closely with the administration, who's just been an absolute breath of fresh air, working with the Haley Driscoll administration. When we think of a number of efforts we've been pushing for many years, some come to mind. Means tested fares, certainly a huge impact already having within our system. When we think about utilizing water transportation, which for a long time we were one of the few, I think, coastal areas in the world that really did not have much of water transportation system, getting more cars off the roads. When we think about the success we've had pursuing federal funding, which sadly is going to be much more challenging moving forward, but work on that, as well as regional rail. We've had some nice progress, but the big question still remains how we're going to fund this moving forward. And as we look at potentially drawing federal funds, or at least a slowdown there with the incoming administration, how are we going to work to build consensus with our communities we represent, as legislators, but also across every sector, every stakeholder throughout Massachusetts? How can we figure out, again, what the need is, but how we're going to pay for that? I do think that in the short term, we've been focused on making sure that the T has the resources it needs to close its pending $700 million to $1 billion gap in recognizing that, they've made some great efforts over recent years to find a way to avoid service cuts. But if we're unable to put resources in the immediate term towards that gap, our constituents are going to bear that burden in service cuts at a time when we're trying to restore trust after the pandemic and our safety issues in recent years, and at a time when it's really hard to get around Boston. How do we get folks back? We certainly can't afford to have cuts there. So, we're focused in that immediate space and making sure that we work together with our partners in the legislature as well as the administration, but also organizations that are represented here throughout the panel and discussion today. Transportation is always one of the biggest issues we face, but I can say sincerely that, we feel a great deal of urgency. I will just close by, this is the last time I'll reference the federal election, but we all need to do a good deal of soul searching and thinking after one went down a few weeks ago. But I found one silver lining in some of our transportation ballot initiatives across the country. When you look at, I think 25 of 26 at the last time I read, transit ballot initiatives, rather specific to transit, I believe, passed to the tune of $25 billion or so. And I say that not as a champion of regional ballot initiatives, though I think they do deserve to be part of our longer term discussions. But those are initiatives that pass through the will of the voters because they knew what they were getting in return. And I think as we talk about transportation finance, it's not just how we're going to pay for things, but how are you going to benefit in your daily lives? So excited to continue the conversation and to learn more from Doug and Lizzie as I have for the last 2 decades or so. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Senator. Music to my ears whenever anyone talks about regional ballot initiatives. So I'm really happy for the reference today. It is my pleasure now to welcome Doug Howgate, the president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. He has served as the president for 2 years and was previously the EVP at Mass Taxpayers. And Doug and I have worked together for a very long time, going back to when he was serving as the budget director in Senate Ways and Means, one of the last times we took a really big transportation funding initiative. So with that, Doug, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for the invitation to participate. And it's funny, Senator Crighton, it's great to see Senator Crighton, great to see Lizzie, obviously great to see Mark as well. But Lizzie and Senator Crighton and I spent a lot of time together in 2013 when we were doing a lot of this transportation work, which is in some ways wonderful because they're great partners to have, and in some ways depressing because a lot of the issues haven't changed. Though, as we'll see in my slides, I think we need to give ourselves a little more credit than sometimes we do. So looking forward to the discussion with Lizzie and then, going through some of PC's work on this. But I was going to share my screen and just go over some of the kind of orient a little bit of this discussion in transportation around competitiveness, and also a little bit of a look back at where we have been and where we're at and how MTF is doing some of these issues. And it's really going to piggyback on a few of the things we heard from Senator Crighton, right? In that, one, I think we need to take a really clear look at the challenges we know are upcoming in the next 2 years. And we also need to make sure that as we're building the case for whatever resources for transportation we pursue, that we're doing it with a view towards making sure that a wide swath of the constituencies in Massachusetts know that they're getting something valuable out of it, right? That was a real lesson for me back in 2013, and I think is critical. So for folks who don't know, MTF, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. We write on a variety of public policy issues that relate to the state's long-term economic health. That means we do a lot on transportation. But I also think one of the reasons maybe why I was asked to speak here today is we also look at issues outside of transportation, right? We look at the larger state budget. And so thinking about some of these transportation needs in the context of our broader economy, but also thinking about what the sources and uses of transportation can be in the context of what is a challenging budget picture. So as I mentioned, let me talk a little bit about competitiveness, then a bit on kind of where we've been, where we are, where we see us as going, and then look forward to the discussion with Lizzie. So back in September, MTF released a competitiveness index to try to address a couple key questions that I think there's been a lot of discussion around, but oftentimes is lacking kind of consistent language about what we actually mean when we talk about this idea of competitiveness. And so we wanted to create an annual way to look at some of those key issues and ask a few key questions, right? What are we competing for? What are we competing on, and with whom are we competing, right? So as we think about that and break that down, I think that has led us to not necessarily shocking conclusions. I think you'll see and hear a lot of things that probably resonate with feelings you might have about things that Massachusetts does well or doesn't do well. But really, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this and why we hope it's a helpful part of the transportation conversation, the housing conversation, as Senator Crighton mentioned, kind of so many of these public policy discussions we're having, is oftentimes this competitiveness gets thrown around in ways that I don't think are constructive, right? We have a number of things, you have to reports seem to say that Massachusetts is the best place in the world. You never want to leave. We're wonderful. Nothing to work on. And half of them say that we're horrible. It's amazing anyone ever lived here to begin with. And we might as well just close up shop because we're done, right? And the reality is, I think all of us who work in this field, whether in government, out of government, or just care about where you live, is neither of those are constructive lenses, I don't think, right? We do some things really well. We do some things not so well. And all we can do is kind of try to improve, right? And so as you think about where we want to improve and how we want to improve, thinking about competitiveness through that lens, I think we find to be a helpful way to orient that conversation. And so let me talk just quickly, generally, before I get into transportation, about this idea of, okay, so what are we good at? And again, I don't think anything on here is going to shock you, but I think it's worth noting that Massachusetts has a kind of natural resource that we're incredibly lucky to possess. We have a very educated workforce that forms this virtuous cycle with our education system, both K-12 and higher ed, and the economic sectors we have, right? Theoretically, those things all kind of work together in what is hopefully kind of a perpetual motion machine to attract smart people to want to live here, pay high wages people can live on, and build industries that are kind of well positioned for the future. Like if you were to have a draft of what states would want if they were going to kind of start from scratch, best education system in the nation is probably something that would go really, really, really high. And we have that. And that's something that is a real opportunity to build on. But as you might imagine, what comes with that are some challenges as well. And what is the top line challenge here? I've got the commute time in a red box, but to me, the top line is what all these other things kind of flow from, which is before the pandemic began, Massachusetts labor force had already started to decline, right? So irrespective of the pandemic, irrespective of all these other things, what do we know? That for a lot of demographic reasons, we were starting to lose our working age labor force. And whatever you think of any of the policy issues we're about to discuss today, whatever you think about tax policy, housing policy, it should be in all of our collective best interests to either move, but assuming we're not going to do that, it should be all of our collective interests to try to make sure we arrest that trend and grow our labor force and make it easier for people to live here. And so when you think about what may be contributing to people moving out, we see it out migration in 25 to 45-year-olds. We see it in wealthier families, and we see it in lower income working class families. Three sectors that we absolutely need. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but commute time and the intersection between commute and housing and work flexibility, that's at the center of it, right? And we know that Massachusetts commute time is among the worst in the world, let alone the worst in the nation. And so the good news, kind of like housing, is it's not great anywhere, right? And so no one's really kind of solved this problem. And every state is different, right? In terms of where people are traveling to, how are they traveling there? And so it's not necessarily a question of like, our goal should be to move from 47th to 42nd. But the reality is that our commute time is a competitive disadvantage for Massachusetts compared to our geographic neighbors, compared to our economic neighbors. And when you think about that, this is from a report we're going to release in a couple of weeks. What you also see is we know that if people are able to predictably get to where they work in 45 minutes or less, half an hour or less, they are much more likely to work in the office. This has huge economic development implications for the city of Boston. And I want to move to the transportation stuff, so I'm going to run through the rest of the competitiveness stuff relatively quickly. But it's important to know that, like, you don't have to believe mass taxpayers. international surveys of traffic time find Boston to be the 8th worst in the world, right? So this is something we've got to figure out, because if people can't get to where they want to go in an amount of time that works for them, they're going to go somewhere else. And then finally, just to, I think, again, emphasize what Senator Crighton said, it's transportation and it's housing and it's how those things work together, right? Because our ability to produce affordable housing is going to be a direct function of people in those areas being able to get to where they work, right? These things have to work together. And I think that's why it's been so critical for us and why we would view it as so central to competitiveness. All right, so now let me shift a little bit to kind of transportation, where we've been. And the reason why I wanted to do this is we know so much more work needs to be done to address MBTA operating deficits in the next year, to address workforce issues, to address regional transit access, to address any number of things that are going to require significant resources. But it's also important to expectation set in terms of where we've been. And the reality is, when you look at the last 5 years compared to the 5 years prior, you do see a significant uptick in transportation resources even before we get to the surtax. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying this is like mission accomplished or we're good or anything like that, but folks need to know that as policymakers are thinking about how to prioritize that next dollar, know that there have been a shift, and I think thanks to the work of folks like Senator Crighton, towards transportation that we need to build on, but we need to also recognize that it has happened. So this is all transportation funding, and the GAA is the budget signed by the governor. This is MBTA non-surtax growth. Huge part of it was an uptick in sales tax growth during the pandemic. That spurred a great deal of it. But we saw big progress this year from the Healy administration, followed by the House and the Senate, in terms of the operating subsidy to the MBTA, right? That doubling of that number, right? When we look at other elements of the transportation system, not in the surtax, sorry, this is a relatively ugly stack bar chart, but it just, again, shows you that we have seen a bit of a directional difference in terms of where those funds have been. To break that down into actual numbers, 2015 to 2020, you saw a compound annual growth rate. This, again, let's ignore the surtax for a second, of 3.5%, not very much. Basically, maybe inflation, 2015 to 2020. 2020 to 25, that compound annual growth rate's been 7.2% before we get to the surtax. And so I think there's a couple of good news stories in there, right? One, clearly this is an issue that's gaining folks' attention, and clearly we've seen some ability to find some capacity that needs to be maintained in the budget. The challenge is, too, there's a lot of other, as we look forward, there are a lot of other areas in the budget that have demands upon it for where resources go as well. And so that's why, and you'll hear me talk about in a second, how we thoughtfully deploy surtax resources predictably and sustainably for transportation, I think has got to be foundational to anywhere we're going for transportation resources. And you see here in FY 2025, the total transportation resources in the surtax ended up being about 40% of total surtax funding. That's a little less, but about the same as it was in FY 24. All right, so where are we in terms of the challenges that we see right now? And I focused on the MBTA in these next two slides because this is what the MTF's research work has really looked at. This is not to undercount huge challenges we see at the local road level, at the MassDOT level, big capital projects, but I want to be mindful of time. So these are two that stand out to us, right? We want the MBTA to work well. We know that's important. For the MBTA to work well and for it to work safely, it needs to have a sufficient number of workers. Using the MBTA's own math as informed by FTA directives, we know that there historically been about 2,000 to 1,500 workers short of where they need to be. They've made a lot of progress in building up their workforce in the last year. That's a really good thing. But guess what? The benefit of being way under your headcount is it saves you a lot of money. The downside of hiring a lot of people is it costs a lot of money. So now as we kind of gave the directive to the MBTA to build up their workforce, their operating deficits have increased, right? That shouldn't surprise anyone. And I think one of the things that we've said is it's critical that we sustain and maintain those operating headcounts and then continue to grow them. And that means we got to get our hands around, at least in the near term, certainly even before we get to long term, budget gaps in FY25, which was addressed through the budget, largely through the use of surtax dollars. But in FY26 and 27, and these are older numbers, these numbers, like most budget gaps in life, they aren't going to get smaller, don't worry. But ballpark it at around $700 million. Those are some challenges we know we need to address The good news is surtax resources have yet to be plugged into these numbers, and that's one of the things we'll talk about again. But these are just two ways I think that we see the immediacy of why it's important to maintain some of the progress we've made over the last year or so, especially in the MBTA for these slides. All right, so where are we going? Just kind of two quick slides on this and then look forward to the conversation with Lizzie. So one, Transportation Funding Task Force. So this is the task force that the Healy-Driscoll administration announced in January. MTF is a part of it. We've got a wide representation. Senator Crighton, others are represented as well. I'm not going to get into kind of the specifics of the task force because we're going to wait for the task force to do its work. But know that its charge is pretty broad. Its membership is pretty broad. And we need to come up with something by the end of next month, right? So stay tuned on that. So again, I'm not going to preview where the task force is going to be, but let me talk about where MTF has been on this, right? Which is the challenge with any major public finance issue is there can be a desire to try to solve everything all at once. And the more you try to solve at the same time, the more challenging it becomes. And so I personally, I think temperamentally, am a big believer in working towards the long term as you solve discrete short-term challenges now. And for me, two things stand out as things that we can do right now that help with resources for transportation and I think put us in a position to address these long-term challenges. One is making sure the MBTA has clarity that their operating deficits for the next 2 years are addressed. There's a plan to do that that doesn't rely on service cuts and headcount reductions. We need to give clarity and take that off the table. Hey, more than 2 years would be great, but let's start with 2 years. Two, we have to develop and implement a transportation surtax strategy. MTF's been calling for 50% of surtax resources for transportation, and it needs to be used in a way that's helping with operating and capital deficits. This has got a huge there's a bunch of reasons for this, all of which are probably obvious, but I'll say them very quickly. Is one, if we're going to convince anyone that transportation needs new resources, we have to use the existing resources that are available for transportation effectively and transparently. And guess what? Folks just voted on the surtax a couple years ago. It goes to education and transportation. You have to demonstrate that those resources are being used thoughtfully and appropriately. And then if there's additional resources necessary, let's have that conversation. But I think it has to start with how we're using those resources. And then the other thing that is, I think, critical to that is, let's assume that next year, there's $1 billion in capital resources for transportation and education, 1.3 or more for operating for transportation and education. That's potentially $1 billion in new resources effectively for transportation. That's a big deal. So while there's always more that we can do, you don't want to ignore the fact that that is a big deal in and of itself, and we got to get it right. And then finally, and this also changes a little bit with the Trump administration, but I do want to credit the Healy-Driscoll administration, House and Senate, for putting in place what I think is one of the kind of best in class proposals in the nation to come up with a way to demonstrate state matching funds for big federal infrastructure projects in transportation and climate. We have that law in the books. We need to deploy that. So I know that was a lot. I know I speak very quickly, but just wanted to cover those things and look forward to talking to Lizzie about it.
Thanks so much, Doug. I really appreciate it. It was a lot, but I really appreciate the whole picture. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that Georgia is going to kick off for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug, for that presentation. We're going to transition now into a bit of a discussion with you and Lizzie about where we see opportunities and what kind of the future looks like for transportation revenue in Massachusetts as you see it. So our first question is that, as you referenced, Massachusetts has been aware of these challenges for decades now, and you've both been involved in conversations about transportation revenue for a number of years now. And what do you see as different about this moment, and what are opportunities for the state? Doug, I'll pass it to you first.
Sure. So there are a couple things that aren't different, right? And I think it's important to keep those in mind as well, which is when transportation means different things to different people in the same regions, and certainly different things to different regions of the state. And unlike, say, K-12 education or Medicaid and Mass Health, where effectively you are providing the same service to people, and the goal is to provide equitably that same service, whether you're in a low-income community, high-income community, Western Mass or Eastern Mass, transportation is a little more challenging, right? You are supporting potentially different types of services for different people depending on how they utilize the system and where they're going, right? And making an effective case to folks that they are benefiting from a better transportation system is going to be a challenge. I think what is new, right? One, I think the stakes are clearly higher in a way that resonate with folks, right? We see in the data that Massachusetts is struggling with those long-term demographic trends. We know we need to keep people in here, and I think it makes sense kind of unlocking this idea of people need to be able to afford to live here, and they need to be able to get where they're going. And so I think that you are starting from a bit of a kind of wind in your sails, that those are two foundational elements to this shared concern about how do we make sure people continue to live and thrive in Massachusetts. I think the other thing that is different is you're starting from a different place than, say, 2009 or 2013, in that we did just pass an income surtax, which devotes significant resources to transportation. And I know people want to do other things and more, and we should have that conversation, but that's a nice place to start from, right? In 2013, we were not starting from the place of significant resources already secured available for transportation. And so I think it's critical as we continue these conversations to figure out how do we make sure we're using those things effectively, both for the transportation system right now and to continue to build a case of where we want that system to go.
And I'd say, I agree with everything Doug just said. I think some of the other things that are different, really to put a fine point on it, is that there is this strong perspective right now of the role that transportation plays in some of our other priorities as a state. So if you care about the environment and GHG reductions, you care about transportation. If you care about the housing issues that Doug was just raising, you care about transportation. And I actually think that is an important piece of the moment, because I think more people are actually involved in trying to advance transportation alongside some of these other priorities. And then the other thing I'll say is that while I don't think that the average resident has like a clear understanding of the surtax and what it does and what they voted on, I do think that particularly MBTA riders did finally feel like they got like a little return on their T investment with all of the work that the general manager has been doing, and everyone at the T has been doing on reducing slow zones and actually making our transportation system, our transit system, feel safer and more efficient. People notice that. I have this long theory that 1 out of every 10 people on the T is talking about the T. And for a while there, it was like 6 out of every 10 people on the T was complaining about the T. But now when I take the T, people are actually talking about the fact that it feels safer and faster. And that I do also think helps people to feel more like, okay, if we invest these dollars, we're actually going to get a return on that investment for our region. And that's important.
And just to build on that for 1 second, because I couldn't agree more, I think that there's such a difference in the argument of, hey, our system doesn't work well, but if you give us more money, we hope it'll work a little better. And we are making the system better. And we've demonstrated to you, we use the resources we have effectively to do that. And with additional resources, we can do more. I think that's a fundamental difference for the MBTA and for other systems as well.
Thanks. And you've both referenced how transportation interacts with other work that the state is doing, whether that's the housing work, climate goals. There's certainly no shortage of challenges in Massachusetts right now with the housing crisis that we're facing and climate change. I'm wondering if you can both talk a bit more about how you see transportation investments fitting into this larger picture of the challenges that our residents are facing, and how you think transportation investments in particular can really support the other goals that we have for the Commonwealth and kind of lift all boats.
Sure. Do you want me to kick us off, Doug?
Sure.
Okay. So, it's funny, actually, Georgia, I was actually just earlier this week, Doug, reading your report about the childcare workforce. And we do some work on that here at MAPC as well. And I was actually, as I was getting ready for this webinar, I was actually thinking about that connection, that when we think about our child care workforce, which I encourage you all to read Doug's report. He did not ask me to plug it, but you should check it out. But when we think about our child care workforce, which is predominantly women and predominantly people of color, often earlier in their careers, these are people who really need ways to get around our region that are efficient and safe and affordable. And I think that connection, even between workforce and transportation is actually really important. And it's part of the reason why, in the interest of full disclosure, we asked Doug to speak today, because of that connection between competitiveness and having a strong transportation system, whether you are driving or taking the T or walking or biking around the region. And so honestly, all of those major priorities, I think, are really connected to each other, that if we just, and I'll also say, as a longtime transportation advocate, that if we actually just silo our advocacy and only say, we just have to fix transportation, then we're actually missing addressing the whole problem. We actually need to be talking about all of these things together. So I think it's important that we are.
Yeah, always appreciate the plug for our early education work, and I couldn't agree more with that. And I mean, to the bottom line here isn't that complicated, right? Which is, we see every day that the ability of folks in Massachusetts to be able to afford where they live and get where they're going is a challenge, right? And overlaid on all that is, we also know that we have a significant and older infrastructure that is at significant risk from extreme weather events, right? And so when you think about the huge needs we have in transportation, in housing, and in climate, and you think about the limited resource in workforce and the limited resources the state is going to have, no matter what we do, right? Resources are always limited. We don't have the luxury of just doing one thing and then saying, okay, on to the next thing now, right? They have to work in concert. We have to make sure that as we invest in transportation, we're doing it in a way that understands that 1,000-year storms are happening much more often than 1,000 years now, right? And at the same time, as we think about where we're incentivizing housing, it makes state policies go so much further, when instead of state dollars having to go for housing investment, we can instead use things like our transportation system to incentivize the market to produce housing in the communities where we know that people can then get to where they're going. And so if you don't, and it's always super complicated, but if you don't think about these things cross-connected, I think we limit our ability to achieve our goals in any of them.
I think that's exactly right, is connecting all of these pieces is really critical to moving this work forward. And to that end, what are areas that you see as opportunities for different groups to work together? The legislature, the current administration, cities and towns, business groups, workforce groups. What does that look like, and how can we elevate the work that they're all doing to move this conversation forward? Doug, I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah, so MAPC is going to have a fascinating perspective on this, because you guys do so much coalition building in different areas. I would say from our perspective at MTF, right? I think that you have a long-standing partnership between the business community and the public sector on transportation issues, right? Our business is only work if people can get where they're going and get there consistently, right? It has huge impacts, and so I think that's a long-standing partnership that sometimes, you know, is stronger or more vocal or less vocal, and now's the time for that hopefully to be more vocal. And I think there's a lot of leadership, you know, on the transportation task force. Rebecca Davis, you know, Jim Rooney, Kate Deneen. There are others as well who are there, who I think are really eloquent advocates here. The other kind of playbook I would look to is the Affordable Homes Act. I think Secretary Augustus and the Healy Driscoll administration did a really great job working with, you know, Rachel Heller at CHAPA. I'm sure you folks saw that, other organizations, to make sure that there was this collective buy-in in terms of the fact that, listen, we may not all agree on every one of these policy prescriptions, but if we all agree in the fundamental challenge, and there's enough in here that we can sign on to, can we help to build that momentum? I think the challenge we're going to see in housing is, great bill got done, great bill got signed. How do we make sure that translates into continued action? And so, you know, nothing's a silver bullet here, but I do think that presents a playbook with the legislative kind of leadership on housing as well, for how you can galvanize these kind of intractable issues that people don't know how to necessarily attack, and start to move the ball forward.
I agree with everything that Doug just said. I think, you know, that central challenge between, we've invested money, how are we actually going to see something get across the finish line, is hard, and actually requires a really coordinated effort. Because I think places, even just looking across the country where we've seen some of these campaign efforts fail, is when there is a coordinated effort to get dollars and then a lack of a coordinated effort to invest dollars. I think, you know, Doug's exactly right. Certainly we're doing that now when we're thinking about what's the next step on Affordable Homes Act, how do we actually get to production closer to transit for all of the communities that we serve, particularly here in Metro Boston? So I think that's really important. It's not just about sort of what are we doing to work together now, but also how are we going to kind of continue? What is it that we're building towards for the future? I also think, cities and towns play an interesting and unique voice in this. And, we're very glad to sort of play that regional role together with our cities and towns that we serve at and the MAPC region. I think, historically, it has sort of been this message that it's transportation is this like state's problem. But I actually think cities and towns are much more engaged. I think we certainly saw that with the plans around the slow zones. We see it a lot with all the bike and pedestrian infrastructure that our communities are trying to build. And I actually think that that role of cities and towns will be really important as we're trying to think about how we advance this bigger picture on investing in transportation. And then, I think to Doug's point, the stakeholder and coalition tables that work together on a lot of different issues are likely to work together on this. And I think some of the work that we're doing in some of those other tables will be echoed through the transportation advocacy effort this time around too.
My final question for both of you is that we've heard a lot today about how we know we need to make improvements to our current transit system to better serve our residents. It's going to cost a lot of money to get the system back to a state of good repair and ensure that we can operate it with the current rate of service. But when you think about what transportation could look like in Massachusetts if we had more revenue, what do you see as possible, and what could that look like for the Commonwealth and for our residents?
Doug, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So one of the things that I think sometimes gets, I know I lose track of is how unique the asset of the MBTA is for the city of Boston. Not many urban areas in the country have access to as robust a network of subway as Boston does. And so I do think, especially as we assess what we want to do, what's got to be first on that list for me is to make sure that we maintain and support the system we have, because that system is not preordained that we have to have it forever. And for all of its challenges, it connects through rapid transit a number of cities and towns around our economic center. That's critically important, right? So for me, that is where, and that's why I think I've been so appreciative of a lot of the work of GM and his team in recent months, is to make sure that you notice the difference if you take the T every day in terms of reduced slow zones, in terms of the increased turnaround times and things like that. So that's one. And then in terms of the other thing, I'm not going to get into kind of specific projects or things like that, but what I will say is this: if folks can consistently use public transit to reliably and consistently get to where they want to be in a way that's cost effective compared to driving, and reliable compared to driving, that could be a game changer for regions of the Commonwealth, right? So when you think, and when you think about the trade-offs in terms of the revenues, I think we need to generate through our transportation system. At the end of the day, people who use it, I think, should be asked to help contribute to its use, depending on how they use it. But when you think about our commuter rail system, if there are ways to make the relative price of using that less and increase the reliability and the frequency, to me is an early kind of an initial step that could have the biggest return on investment in terms of a few of our different goals. So there's a lot of wonderful bigger ticket projects that I think we absolutely need to assess, given the rubric of who else is helping us pay for it, how many people does it help, and kind of what those trade-offs are. But for me, that core MBTA system and trying to make sure we are maximizing the reliability, price competitiveness, and use of our regional rail system, those are top two for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the need to kind of protect and support the system that we have, not just for the city of Boston, but for the whole region. And I would also add, sometimes unpopular opinion, that I also think the system needs to be able to be adaptable and grow to meet some of the changing needs. I think, we have seen a lot of demographic shifts in our region over the course of the past 10, 20, 30 years, and our bus system is more or less the same. And maybe it's time to actually update that to meet the needs of people who are moving across our region or living in one place and working in another, because I think that's an important reality of the place where we live, which is small and dense. I think the other thing that I would say is actually in light of some of what Senator Crighton was talking about, of things that are going to happen on the federal level, is thinking about the region that we want to have right here in our Commonwealth and the opportunity that we have to actually create it. So, to Doug's point that if people can actually get around our region car free, if they're living in one place and working in another, we actually have an opportunity to meet our climate goals and to actually address the public health challenges that come from not meeting our climate goals. Same thing I think is true on housing. So I think the promise of investing in our transportation system is that it actually unlocks a lot of those other pieces that we were talking about that we really care about across the region. And so I think it's important for it to be able to be sustained and to grow and change a little bit, because it needs to, and also recognize what it is that we have here in Massachusetts that we want to continue to have.
Thank you both for these engaging in this conversation. I think that will be the conclusion of this piece of the agenda. I'm going to turn it over now to Mark Drayson, actually.
Thanks, Georgia.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Tomorrow or next week, I have a lot of.
Thank you all so much. I want to give a big thank you to Senator Crighton and to Doug Howgate for providing a tremendous amount of both inspiration and factual information about this very complicated but incredibly important question of how we finance the transportation system we have, how we afford the transportation system we need. I also want to give a shout out to my own staff for the tremendous amount of work that they did, not only to prepare this webinar, but also the really incredible report that is being released today. Georgia, Adi, Leah, Lizzie, Eric Barassa, our transportation director, and others who worked so hard on all the background research, testing questions again and again to make sure that the information was the best it could possibly be, dealing with my obnoxious edits 2, 3, 4 times, and producing something that I really think is going to be a tremendously effective and useful roadmap for us, for the commission, for the legislature, for the administration, and for advocates over the course of the next session of the General Court, the next 2 years. I also want to introduce a long-term friend and in some ways a mentor of mine, the former representative and Transportation Committee Chair and the first mayor of Braintree, Joe Sullivan. Joe is not on the screen, I don't think, but he is in the audience, in the group, and we're very pleased to have him. Whenever I have a big question about transportation, or to be perfectly honest, when I have little questions, I always know that I can call Joe and gain some insight, as I did on a few issues that appear in this report today. So Joe, thank you very much for joining us. We know you're going to be a leader in this effort as well. I want to give a little bit of a call to arms, so to speak, folks. For those of you who are ancient like me and you spend time watching LinkedIn and stuff like that, you'll know that recently, apparently, I had the anniversary of my being at MAPC 22 years. Now, honestly, LinkedIn's got it wrong. They're a month and a week off, but I got congratulations from all of you, or from a lot of you, for my 22nd anniversary at MAPC. It's been a wonderful place to be. I've loved all the people I've worked with, but it's a long time. And this issue of not having enough money to invest in the day-to-day operation of our transportation system, and especially our transit systems, that's plural, because it's not just the T, it's all the RTAs across the state, from Provincetown to Pittsfield. Not having enough money to invest in transit, not having enough money to do critical bridge and road work, not having enough money for regular maintenance, so we have to defer it and make it more expensive, and finally, not having enough capital money to be able to invest in the system that we truly deserve and need to keep pace with our economy. These are all very, very old issues. And there have been years in which we've really stepped up and taken 2, 3 steps forward to try and address these issues. I think particularly of the time that we raised the gas tax under Speaker DeLeo's leadership in the House and also under the leadership of the Senate. And that was a great step. And there are some years when we've had really good appropriations, but it's actually not been since the year 2000 under the leadership of Joe Sullivan as chair of the Transportation Committee that we had a comprehensive review and reform of the money that we put into transportation. That's when we decided, among other things, that I won't list all of them now, that we would put a penny on the sales tax to the T. We also at the same time took a penny of the sales tax and put it to the school building authority. And we made a major commitment going forward about how we were going to address transportation funding issues. And thank God we did, because it has worked tremendously well. But it hasn't worked well enough in the long term, did for a number of years, hasn't worked well enough in the long term, and it's been a quarter century. Joe and I are old men. We need new solutions. We need additional funds. And while debt is important and capital is important, the capital funds at the MBTA and elsewhere are already increasing. The MassDOT spend rate for capital is going up, with generous transportation bond bills and with commitments now on the part of several administrations, and with reform at the T, meaningful reform that enables them to manage more capital dollars in a shorter period of time. The capital issues are not solved, but we've made a significant step forward, I would say. The big issue in my mind is operating and being able to generate the revenue that we need to maintain the operations of the T, the RTAs, our roadway and bridge work, et cetera, across the state. And the principles that we've laid out in this document about generating enough money, generating it from multiple sources, making sure that we have climate in the picture when we make these decisions. So all the decisions we make are going to advance our climate goals, and focusing on equity so that we do not put all of the burden on the lowest income people in our state. All of those are critical principles that have to go into the administration proposals for transportation fundraising and the legislature's decisions about what funds we are going to raise. The challenge is, and I think we can put the principles down now, the challenge is that we are going to need multiple sources of revenue. And some of the people in this room, they won't like tolls, and some people won't like sales tax, and some people won't like regional ballot initiatives, and some people will like this, but they'll have a problem with it. I think we all have to get together around a fundamental principle. We need to generate more operating revenue. We have 2 years to do it. We can't kick this can down the road any further, because with a $700 million deficit at the T, we've run out of road to kick the can down. And we are going to have to take revenue from a variety of places. The key in selecting those choices is to make sure that overall, everybody is contributing something, and no one sector in our society is unfairly burdened. We all use the transportation system. We all depend upon the transportation system. Even people who don't use the T or the RTA buses depend upon that system because the traffic is less when they're in their cars. Our economy and our ability to continue to grow our economy depend on the transportation system. And that means we have 2 years to solve the operating deficit problem. And I'm going to encourage everyone in this space to join that campaign, to be part of that effort, and to help our leaders make wise decisions and wise choices to move us forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Georgia and Adi, who are going to outline some of the specific elements in the paper we're releasing today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I am going to quickly go through some of the ways that MAPC has outlined this report. Lizzie just shared in the chat with everyone the link to the Now Live website that outlines the full report, as well as some of those recommendations that we've included. We have put our recommendations into three different buckets,
Yes.
looking at the levels of government, because we know, as has been said multiple times on this call today, this will require a full government approach to address the challenges that the transportation sector faces. Looking at the municipal level options for the state legislature, as well as opportunities for the administration to act. So some of these municipal levers that we suggest that the state look at include things like commercial parking taxes, which my colleague Adi will talk a bit more about after, regional ballot initiatives, which has been talked about on this call already, value capture tools, and regional mitigation funds. We know that there is a large role for the legislature to play, and there are a number of pieces here that we hope that they take up this session. These have been filed as bills in the past, and MAPC is working in partnership with our advocacy partners to pursue some of these newer options as we see opportunities arise to choose a variety of new mechanisms to ensure that we are fully funding our transportation system. This includes looking at things like TNC fees, retail delivery fees, dynamic road pricing, airplane sales tax loopholes, automatic traffic enforcement, and ensuring that the sales tax amount dedicated to the MBTA is really meeting the need that the legislature intended when it made that dedication a number of years ago. And finally, we know that there are some pieces of this puzzle that the administration can act on as well. Things like vehicle registration fees, expansion of tolling throughout the Commonwealth, user fee increases, and looking at what MBTA assessments look like throughout the MBTA region. There is no one silver bullet here that is going to fully fix the transportation revenue situation that the Commonwealth is in. We know that there's going to need to be a variety of these proposals taken up and engaged in at all levels of government so that we could really fill the needs that cities and towns are facing, that the state is facing, and build the system that we really want to see. So just as a reminder, everyone who's participated in this webinar will get that full report emailed to them, and as well as the white papers that our transportation team has produced that really does a deep dive into some of these more specific recommendations that MAPC has outlined. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Adi, who is going to go to a bit more depth about what those look like.
Thanks so much, Georgia, and thanks everyone for joining us for this really critical conversation this afternoon. My name's Adi Nocher. I'm a senior transportation planner at MAPC, and with the few minutes we have left here today, I'm just going to provide a short overview of these three policy briefs that we released earlier this summer, taking a slightly deeper dive on commercial parking taxes, retail delivery fees, and transportation network company fees. We had the opportunity to present these white papers to the Governor's Transportation Funding Task Force earlier this summer. You can also find those white papers at the webpage that Lizzie put in the chat, and we'll follow up in the email as well. So just a quick note on each of these three policies. These are all issues that MAPC has a long track record of engagement and advocacy and research around. The first is allowing cities and towns to tax private parking facilities. There's a number of US cities that already impose sales taxes on these commercial parking facilities, including New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Pittsburgh at a bit of an outlier with a higher tax rate than most. But these cities are all generating significant revenue through taxing privately owned public parking. But cities and towns in Massachusetts are limited in their ability to levy these taxes. It's only Boston, Springfield, and Worcester that can levy these taxes at convention center facilities, and only $2 per vehicle per day. So when we crunched some numbers, taking a deeper dive on this, we found that if you can implement a 10 to 25% tax on commercial parking, looking just at Boston, Cambridge, Worcester, and Springfield alone, you could generate between $29 to $74 million in annual revenue for statewide and local transportation needs. So tremendous potential just with this one measure here. Next slide, please. Another one we've been looking at is implementing a fee structure for retail deliveries. This can include package deliveries via retailers like Amazon, as well as prepared food deliveries via vendors and platforms like DoorDash, grocery deliveries via Peapod as well. So there's a whole host of deliveries that could potentially be subject to charges. We looked at states like Colorado and Minnesota that have implemented retail delivery fees at different price points, and applying similar metrics to Massachusetts, depending on the fee imposed, You could raise as much to 104 million to 192 million per year, if not more. So again, lots of potential here with another revenue measure. Next slide. And last but not least of our three policy briefs, increasing transportation network company surcharges. Massachusetts already does have a TNC fee in place at a flat rate of 20 cents per trip. That raised about $90 million in the 6-year period from 2017 to 2013, but it's not really keeping up with what the need and the demand is. And we've seen other cities and states that have flat rates as high as $3 per trip, or percentage assessments up to 12% in New York City. So if we were to implement a 6.25% assessment as a portion of the trip fare, we would see that generate $120 to $140 million in annual revenue, so far surpassing what we were able to generate over a 6-year period using a 20-cent flat fee. So again, tremendous funds that are being left on the table. So over $600 million left on the table over these past 6 years. So can we bring in substantial more revenue moving forward? This is a great mechanism to do so. And just to reiterate what Georgia and others have shared earlier, none of these solutions are silver bullets. None of these solutions are going to solve our transportation finance crisis by themselves. We really do need to think about a comprehensive package that can include a whole host of these measures that I just shared, as well as other ideas that are included in our recommendations document that Georgia summarized, and many of the great ideas that those of you on this call are bringing to the table as well. So with that, we just want to thank you for your time. It's going to take continued engagement and advocacy from all of us to make this push moving forward. And I want to turn it over to Lizzie and Mark to close us out.
Thank you so much, Adi. Really appreciate you going quickly through those recommendations. And again, you can go into greater detail online on the website, and I encourage all of you to do so. I think the real take-home message here is that no one source of revenue is going to actually meet all of these needs, and we all actually need to be working together to make sure that we are getting this over the finish line and really meaningfully investing in our transportation system, because we really can't afford not to. I want to offer thanks again to Senator Crighton for joining us today, and for Doug Howgate for joining us from Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and also to the incredible MAPC team that worked on this. Like Mark said, there was a very large group of folks who were involved in getting these recommendations done, and we're so grateful to all of them for their great work on this. And we look forward to working with all of you this legislative session to make sure that we are advancing investments in transportation. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.